My son changed the locks on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday, not even a cold one, just an ordinary October morning in Columbus, Ohio, when I drove back from my doctor's appointment to find a shiny new deadbolt on the front door of the house I had lived in for 31 years, and a note tucked under the welcome mat that said, in my son's careful handwriting, "Mom, we need to talk. Call me." I stood on that porch for a long moment. The rose bushes I had planted the year we moved in were still blooming, stubborn and late season. The wind chimes my husband had hung from the eave were still turning. Everything looked exactly the same, and nothing was. My name is Margaret Ellen Howe, and I was 68 years old, and I had just become a woman who could not get into her own home. My husband passed in March of that year. 35 years of marriage to a quiet, decent man named Dennis Howe, a civil engineer who loved crossword puzzles and terrible puns and made coffee every morning at exactly 6:15 whether he needed to be anywhere or not. He died of a stroke on a Sunday afternoon while sitting in his armchair watching a baseball game. He was there and then he was not, and the particular silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever known. Our son, my son, was named Brian. He was 41, lived 20 minutes away in Westerville with his wife and 2 children, and had always been the kind of man who managed things. That was how he described himself at family dinners. "I manage things, Mom." He had his father's jaw and his father's hands, and none of his father's patience. In the weeks after Dennis died, Brian had been present and purposeful, handling the funeral arrangements, the death certificates, the accounts, the paperwork. I had been grateful. I was grieving. I was not thinking clearly. And Brian was thinking for both of us. And I had trusted that, because he was my son, and I had raised him, and I believed that meant something. What I had not fully understood, in those fog-heavy weeks of early widowhood, was that Brian had been managing things for himself. The paper he had placed in front of me on a Wednesday evening in April, 3 weeks after his father's funeral, was something he described as a routine estate document. "A transfer for tax purposes," he said. "Just a formality to simplify things," he said. I was on my second glass of wine and my first month of sleeping alone in a 31-year bed, and my son was sitting at my kitchen table with his reading glasses on looking responsible, and I signed where he pointed. It was a quitclaim deed. I signed over the house. I did not understand this until September, when I found the county property records online by accident while looking for something else entirely, and saw that the address I had called home since Ronald Reagan's first term was now listed under the name Brian Keith Howe. When I confronted him, he was calm. That was the most frightening part. He was utterly, completely calm. "Mom," he said, "you're 68. The house is paid off, but the taxes are high and the maintenance is expensive, and you don't have the income to manage it long term. This protects you. This protects everyone. Nothing has to change right now." I asked him what right now meant. He looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is simply waiting for you to catch up. "Rhonda and I have been talking," he said. His wife. "The house makes more sense as a rental property. You'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, easier to maintain. We could find you a really nice apartment." I told him I didn't want an apartment. I wanted my house. He said, "It's not technically your house anymore, Mom." And 3 weeks later, on that Tuesday in October, I came home from the doctor to find a new lock and a note that said to call him, which I did not do, because there was nothing left in that conversation that I wanted to hear. I had $214 in my checking account. My monthly Social Security was $1,340. My savings, which Dennis and I had built carefully over decades, had been in a joint account that Brian had helped me transfer to a new account in the weeks after Dennis died. Another simplification. Another formality, and the balance of that account was $1,100 because Brian had, over a period of 6 months, moved the rest. Legally, because I had also signed the paperwork that made him a joint account holder. I sat in my car in the driveway of my own home for 2 hours before I called my daughter. My daughter lived in Nashville. Her name was Claire, and she was 37, and she worked in hospital administration, and she had a spare bedroom. And she answered on the second ring, and when I finished telling her what had happened, there was a silence that told me she had been waiting, in some corner of herself, to receive exactly this phone call. "Come here," she said. "Come right now. Don't call Brian back." I drove to Nashville with a suitcase and a box of photographs and the particular cold clarity of a woman who has just realized that the danger she was in had been inside her own family the whole time. Claire's spare bedroom had yellow curtains and a view of a parking lot, and it was the most dignified space I had inhabited in months, which tells you something about how quickly a life can change. I slept better than I expected. Not because I was at peace, but because some part of me had already known, at a level below conscious thought, that something had been wrong for a long time, and the exhausting work of not knowing was finally over. Brian called twice and texted 4 times in the first week. His messages were calm and reasonable, and entirely focused on presenting himself as a concerned son, trying to help his elderly mother make practical decisions. I read them carefully and showed them to Claire, who read them with a stillness that told me she was very angry and choosing not to show me how angry. "He thinks you're going to come back," she said. "He thinks you don't have options." I thought about that. The call came on a Thursday morning, 11 days after I arrived in Nashville. I didn't recognize the area code Ohio, but not Columbus. The woman on the other end of the line had a voice like gravel over glass, low and direct, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who has made a great many phone calls in her life and does not waste time on unnecessary preamble. "Is this Margaret Howe?" she said. "Dennis's wife?" I said it was. She said her name was Evelyn Marsh. She was Dennis's sister. I knew of Evelyn the way you know of a country you've never visited. Dennis had mentioned her rarely, and always in the past tense, the way people mentioned things that ended badly and were not revisited. They had been estranged since their father's death, 2 decades before a dispute over the estate, he had told me once, that had said things neither of them could quite unfold. He had written her a letter once, he told me. She had not written back. She had found out about Dennis's death through an obituary. She had spent 3 months deciding whether to call. "I have something that belongs to you," she said. "Something Dennis sent me 4 years ago. I think you need to see it." I asked her what it was. She said, "His will." Dennis had made a will. Of course he had. Dennis was an engineer, a meticulous man who believed in documentation and preparation. What I had not known, what I had not thought to ask in the fog of early grief, and the capable management of my capable son, was that the will I had seen Brian reference in those early weeks, a simple document, straightforward, Brian had said was not Dennis's most recent will. Dennis had updated his will 4 years before he died. He had done it quietly, without telling me, through an attorney in a small office in Worthington, Ohio, a man named Gerald Park, who had sent a copy to Evelyn for safekeeping because Dennis, apparently, had been uncertain about Brian for longer than I had been. The updated will was explicit. The house on Maple Creek Drive was to remain in my possession for as long as I wished to live in it. The joint savings account was to be distributed equally between me and Claire. Brian received a specific bequest, a sum of money, not insignificant, but finite, and nothing else. I sat in Claire's kitchen reading this on my laptop screen while Evelyn walked me through it over the phone, and I felt something I can only describe as a door swinging open onto a room I didn't know Dennis had built for me. "He called me 6 months before he died," Evelyn said, and her voice changed slightly, the gravel softening in some internal way. "He said he'd been watching Brian with you, and it worried him. He said he didn't want to upset the family over something that might never happen. But he wanted the real will somewhere safe, with someone Brian didn't have access to. A pause. He never thought Brian would move so fast after he was gone. I did not say anything for a long moment. I was thinking about Dennis at 6:15 inches the morning making coffee, his particular way of moving through the kitchen without turning on any lights, how I had always thought that was a small, strange habit, and now understood it had been consideration, this very specific form of care for the person still sleeping that had characterized the whole of his life with me. He had been protecting me from 4 years away. "What do I do?" I asked. Evelyn said, "You need a probate attorney, and you need to move quickly. Because the longer that deed sits in Brian's name, the more he can claim reliance on it." Claire found the attorney. Her name was Susan Adler, a probate litigator out of Columbus, who drove a sensible car, and wore her reading glasses in her hair, and took notes in a small spiral notebook, with the focused efficiency of someone who found nothing about family betrayal particularly surprising. I met her in her office on a Monday morning. Claire drove me, sat beside me, and said almost nothing during the meeting, because she understood, correctly, that this was mine to tell. Susan listened without interrupting. She reviewed the documents I brought: the updated will, the quitclaim deed Brian had had me sign, the account transfer records, the property registration. She set each one down with precise movements and then looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "The deed is a problem," she said, "but not an insurmountable one. You signed under circumstances that a court could reasonably characterize as undue influence. You were 3 weeks out from your husband's death. Your son presented the document as a formality without adequate explanation. You were not represented by independent counsel." She paused. "What's in your favor is the existence of this will. It establishes that Dennis's explicit intention was the opposite of what Brian executed, and the timing of the account transfers within 30 days of your husband's death, while you were demonstrably grieving and incapacitated, is going to be very difficult for Brian to explain in a way that doesn't sound like what it was." I asked her what it was. "Financial elder abuse," she said plainly. "That's the legal term. I know he's your son. I'm telling you the legal term." I sat with that for a moment. I let it be true in the way that true things need to be sat with before they can be acted on. "What do we do?" I asked. "We file to contest the deed." I told her to proceed. Brian called that same evening. I did not answer. He texted 3 hours later. "Mom, I heard you talk to a lawyer. I think we should talk before this goes somewhere. Nobody wants it to go." I showed the text to Susan the next morning. She documented it. The thing about Brian that I had perhaps never fully understood, or never allowed myself to fully understand, was that his management style had always included a particular tool: the management of my perception of myself. He had spent years, in ways I had not cataloged until I began cataloging them, reminding me of my limitations, my forgetfulness, my difficulty with technology, the time I had mixed up the grandchildren's birthdays, the time I had written a check to the wrong account, small, ordinary human errors that he had held and referenced and assembled into a portrait of a woman who needed managing. I had accepted this portrait, had worn it like a garment someone else had chosen, because he was my son, and I had trusted that he knew me. What he had not known, what I had perhaps not fully known myself, was that the woman who needed managing had also raised 2 children alone for 3 months, when Dennis took a job contract in Seattle, had chaired a school board through a redistricting crisis that made the local paper twice, had cared for her mother through 2 years of dementia without ever once losing her own direction. I was not a woman who needed managing. I was a woman who had been managed. There is a difference. And understanding it at 68, under circumstances like these, is both late and exactly on time. Brian retained an attorney. His name was Thomas Carver, and he was the kind of attorney who wore cufflinks on a Tuesday and addressed opposing counsel, with a particular cold courtesy that was indistinguishable from contempt. His first letter to Susan argued that I had signed the quitclaim deed voluntarily and with full understanding that the account transfers were made with my explicit consent and that Brian was acting in his mother's best interest in all matters. His second letter arrived 8 days later and shifted significantly in tone. It suggested that my mental capacity at the time of the signing was something that could be examined, that there were concerns about my cognitive function in the months following Dennis's death, that witnesses could be produced who had observed my confusion and disorientation during that period. Susan called me when that letter arrived. She read me the relevant portion over the phone. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "He's going to say I didn't know what I was signing because I wasn't mentally competent." "Yes," she said. "That argument," I said carefully, "cuts in both directions." "It does," she said. "If you weren't competent, you couldn't have validly signed the deed. His entire case rests on the deed being valid. He can't have it both ways." There was a pause, and I could hear in it what I recognized as one attorney appreciating the logic of another's position. "You've thought about this," Susan said. "I've had time," I said. What Brian did next, I learned from Claire, who learned it from a mutual friend in Columbus who saw it happen. He called our pastor. He called 3 of my friends from the neighborhood. He called my book club organizer, a woman named Pat, who had known me for 12 years, and who, to her credit, called me directly afterward to tell me that my son had been asking her questions about my memory, my judgment, my capacity to handle complex decisions, and that she had told him she found me sharp as a tack and suspected he knew that. Pat's call made me cry, briefly, in Claire's yellow-curtained spare room, not from grief. From the specific relief of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to lie. I called Pat back the next day and told her, briefly, what was happening. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What can I do?" I told her to write down what Brian had asked her and when. She did. Susan added it to the file. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for a January morning in the Franklin County Probate Court, a building that smelled of paper and institutional carpet and the accumulated weight of other people's family disputes. I wore my good navy coat. Claire sat beside me at the petitioner's table. Susan sat on my other side, her notebook open, her reading glasses in her hair. Brian was across the room with Thomas Carver. He did not look at me when I came in, which was a choice I noted and set aside. His wife, Rhonda, was in the gallery. She watched me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not hostility exactly, more like the look of someone who had expected a quieter outcome and was recalibrating. Evelyn had driven down from Crestline for the hearing. She sat in the second row of the gallery, compact and gray-haired, with Dennis's nose and Dennis's quality of stillness. We had met in person only once, the week before, over coffee at a diner halfway between Columbus and Nashville. She had given me a box of Dennis's letters. Letters he had written to her over the years. Infrequently, attempting the relationship in small, careful ways. She had kept them. She had not written back, and the weight of that, I could see, she was still carrying. "He was a good man," she said to me at the diner, over her coffee cup. "I know I don't have the right to say that, given everything." "You do have the right," I said. "He would have wanted you here." She had looked at her coffee for a long moment. Then she had said, quietly, "Tell me what you need." The hearing proceeded with the formal logic of legal process. Dennis's attorney, Gerald Park, testified about the circumstances of the will's creation and update, including the specific conversation he'd had with Dennis, in which Dennis had explained his reasons for the changes. He testified that Dennis had been clear, purposeful, and fully competent at each signing. That testimony was corroborated by a written statement from Dennis's physician, Dr. Carolyn Marks, who had treated him for the 7 years before his death and confirmed his cognitive function had been unimpaired throughout. Susan presented the account transfer records with a timeline overlay that showed, without commentary, the sequence. Dennis's death in March. The joint account set up in April, the first major transfer in May, the last in August. The transfers totaled $214,000. Thomas Carver presented Brian's case. He called Brian to testify about my emotional state in the months after Dennis's death, my difficulty with financial documents, my reliance on Brian for practical matters. Brian spoke in a careful, measured tone. He used the word overwhelmed 7 times. He said he had been trying to protect me. He said I had understood what I was signing. He said I had seemed grateful. Susan's cross-examination was brief and precise. She asked Brian whether he had recommended I consult an independent attorney before signing the quitclaim deed. He said he hadn't thought it was necessary. She asked whether he had explained to me that the effect of signing the deed was to transfer legal ownership of the property to him. He said he had explained it in general terms. She asked whether he had a copy of Dennis's will at the time he had the deed prepared. He said he had. She asked which will. He said the one he had found in Dennis's desk. She set a document on the table in front of him. "Is this the will you found?" He looked at it. "Yes." She set a second document beside the first. "Are you aware of this will?" A pause. "A long one. The kind that fills a room. I've seen that recently." "Yes. When did you first become aware of its existence?" He looked at Carver. Carver made no expression. "In the last few months," Brian said. "So at the time you prepared the quitclaim deed, you were not aware that your father had updated his will to explicitly protect your mother's ownership of the marital home?" "No." "And had you been aware," Susan said, her voice even and without drama, "would you have proceeded?" He didn't answer immediately. "Would you have had your recently widowed mother sign over her home to you?" Susan said. "Had you known her husband had explicitly written that home to her in a legally executed will?" Carver objected. Sustained. But the shape of the question remained in the room like furniture. What broke it open was not testimony. It was a document. Thomas Carver, in his case, submitted a letter he claimed showed Dennis's late expressed wish to simplify the estate by transferring property to Brian. A letter in Dennis's handwriting, dated 8 months before his death. It was the first I had heard of any such letter. Susan requested time to examine it. The judge granted 15 minutes. She came back to the table and leaned close to me and said, quietly, "Dennis was left-handed." I looked at her. "Yes, this letter is written by a right-handed person." I looked at the letter across the room. I thought of Dennis at the kitchen table, the particular angle of his arm when he wrote, the leftward slant of every birthday card and grocery list and love note he had ever produced in my presence. 35 years of watching that hand move across paper. "Tell the judge," I said. Susan told the judge. She requested forensic examination of the document. The judge granted it. Brian, across the room, had gone very still. The kind of still that is not stillness but the suspension of motion. The body deciding what comes next. He looked at Rhonda in the gallery. She looked back at him with an expression that had changed, that was no longer recalibrating but something closer to afraid. I did not look away from the front of the room. The forensic examination took 9 days. The report found multiple inconsistencies between the submitted letter and authenticated samples of Dennis's handwriting, including directionality of pen strokes, letter formation, and the angle of baseline that is characteristic of left-handed writers. The ink was also dated to within the past year. Dennis had been dead for 10 months. Thomas Carver withdrew from Brian's representation within a week of the report. Susan told me this on the phone on a Wednesday evening. She was professionally neutral in her delivery, which is to say I could hear, underneath the neutral, a specific kind of satisfaction that good attorneys feel when a case resolves in the direction of justice. "What happens now?" I asked. "The deed contest will succeed," she said. "The account recovery is already largely in process. And the submission of a fraudulent document in a probate proceeding is a felony in Ohio. I sat with that. He's my son, I said. I know, she said. I'm telling you the legal situation. What you do with it personally is your own. I thought about that for a long time. The probate hearing reconvened in February. Brian appeared without Carver, with a replacement attorney who had clearly been briefed on the situation and moved through the proceedings with the careful efficiency of someone who understood the shape of what had already happened and was here to minimize further damage. Brian was quieter. The managed certainty was gone. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like a man who was not in control of what came next. I did not feel triumph when I looked at him. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something older and heavier and more complicated. The grief of a specific kind of betrayal that has no clean name, because the person who betrayed you is also the person you spent years of your life loving and teaching, and watching grow up in the house they then tried to take from you. There is no version of that feeling that is simple. The judge ruled that the quitclaim deed had been obtained under circumstances of undue influence and was void. Dennis's updated will was admitted to probate. The house was returned to my ownership. The account recovery order was finalized. Brian's bequest, as Dennis had written it, stood he received what his father had intended him to receive, which was fair, which was what Dennis had decided, and which was not nothing. The fraudulent letter was referred to the Franklin County District Attorney. I signed the final documents in Susan's office on a cold Thursday in late February. Evelyn was there. Claire was there by phone, her voice slightly hoarse from a cold she'd been fighting for a week. Susan shook my hand after I signed and said, "Go home." I did. The house on Maple Creek Drive looked exactly the same as it always had, which surprised me and didn't. The rose bushes were cut back for winter. The wind chimes were still. I stood on the porch for a long moment, with my keys in my hand. Not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I wanted to feel it properly, the fact of standing on the right side of my own door. Then I unlocked it and went inside and turned on the kitchen lights and made coffee. Spring came slowly that year, the way Ohio springs do, gray, then grudging, then suddenly and completely green. I settled back into my life with the particular attention of someone who has had it removed and returned and knows now what it is worth. I fixed the kitchen faucet that had been dripping since September, because Brian had said he would handle it. And I had waited. And now I was done waiting for anyone to handle things on my behalf. I called Pat and took her to lunch. I went back to my book club. I started sleeping through the night again, which had not been possible in the Maple Creek Drive house for the 6 months of Brian's quiet management of my life, and which I now understood had been my body's way of knowing something my conscious mind was still explaining away. Evelyn came for a weekend in April. We walked in the park behind the neighborhood and talked about Dennis in the way you can only talk about someone with a person who loved them differently than you did. She told me stories from his childhood I had never heard. I told her about the crossword puzzles, the terrible puns, the coffee at 6:15. We laughed together in a way that felt earned. She stayed in the guest room, and on Sunday morning she came downstairs, and I had coffee already made, and we sat at the kitchen table and said very little, and it was one of the better mornings I had in a long time. She said, before she left, "He would be glad you fought." I thought she was right. Claire came up from Nashville for 2 weeks in May, and we repainted the living room, a color Dennis had always vaguely wanted, and I had always deferred. A soft, warm gold that changed the light in the room entirely. She asked me, on the second day of painting, whether I had thought about what I wanted the next part of my life to look like. I told her I had been thinking about it since October. I had spoken, in the months of the legal process, to 2 other women in my county whose families had navigated situations similar to mine. A woman in her 70s, whose nephew had handled her finances after a hospitalization, a woman in her early 60s, who had signed documents she didn't understand after her husband's illness. I had found them through Susan, who had mentioned, carefully and with no pressure, that such situations were more common than most people knew, and that the women navigating them often had no one who had been through it. I had kept those conversations. I thought about them. I want to do something with what happened, I told Claire. I don't know exactly what yet, but I want it to be useful. She looked at me with the particular expression she had always made since she was about 9 years old, when she was making up her mind whether to say something directly or keep it to herself. I think you should, she said. I don't need you to think so, I said, which made her laugh. The legal consequences for Brian unfolded over the following months with the patience of institutions that do not hurry. The district attorney opened an investigation into the fraudulent document. Rhonda, I heard through Claire's information channels, had consulted a divorce attorney in the spring. The Westerville house went on the market in September. I did not send anything. I did not call. He was a chapter that had happened, and the lesson of it that you can love someone and still need to be protected from them was one I carried without bitterness. Because bitterness is heavier than most people want to admit, and I was done carrying other people's weight. I started the group in June. Informal at first, just a meeting room at the library on Thursday evenings, and a notice in the church bulletin and on the community board at the grocery store. Women navigating estate and financial concerns after loss. All welcome. 7 women came to the first meeting. 14 to the second. Susan came as a guest speaker. Pat brought coffee. Evelyn drove down and sat in the back row and said nothing, but stayed until everyone had left and helped fold the chairs. I did not think of it as remarkable, what I had done. I did not think of myself as a woman who had triumphed, or been rescued, or reversed her fortune by luck. What I thought was that I had been a woman who knew her own house, who had watched her husband make coffee at 6:15 every morning for 35 years, who had signed a paper she should not have signed, and found her way back from it by refusing to believe that the story was already finished. Dennis had left me the house. He had left me more than that. He had left me the evidence, in 4 years of careful legal preparation, that he had seen clearly, that he had known me, that whatever could not be said between us in life had been said in the only language he could guarantee would reach me. I put the will in the top drawer of my dresser. I kept the crossword puzzle book he had left on the side table by his chair. I drank coffee in the mornings at 6:15. Not because I had to, but because some habits are worth keeping. It is never too late to understand what you are worth to the person who actually saw you, and it is never too late to act as though you believed them. What would you have done in that driveway, with the new lock and the note? Leave a comment. I'd truly like to know. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to Emma's Stories. Thank you for listening.